excited today to have Matt Tenney here with us today, continuing his conversation on the Mindfulness Edge. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Ozzy.
And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I know I just sent a chat to all of you guys, and I'll verbally ask the question as well, as some of you are still jumping online. But if you could please let Matt know if you already have a mindfulness practice of some sort already implemented in your life or not, that would be great. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Ozzy. Yeah, if you all don't mind just typing in the chat box right quick, you could just say a yes or no. That I was thinking that might just help us decide how we'll best spend our time. Because I presume that everybody kind of got the overview a couple weeks ago when we met. But I'm just curious how many people already have a practice.
So
And Ozzy, I don't seem to see any answers.
a few people are writing in and they're saying no, they do not.
Okay, okay. So then I'll go on the assumption that maybe a few people do, but I'll give a good introduction to the practice, but I'd like to leave lots of room for question and answer. Uh, so you can facilitate the question and answer at the end, right, Ozzy?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Happy Thursday to you. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. It's the Mindfulness Edge and how it can rewire your brain for excellence. And I think the key part is doing that without adding to our schedule. So if you were to think of all of the activities that you engage in every day that are pretty mundane, simple activities like brushing your teeth, standing in line, driving the car to work, or commuting to work in some other way, washing the dishes when you get home, I think it's a pretty long list of activities that we engage in that, from a professional standpoint, are at best not productive. And I think in many cases these activities can be frustrating, anxiety provoking. For instance, if we're stuck in traffic on our way to work and we're late, or in your case, if you're on your way to an appointment to meet with a client and you're stuck in traffic and late, it can be anxiety provoking, frustrating. So what I'd like to suggest, that this is kind of what this talk is about and what the book is about, is how we can take those moments that we engage in every single day, which I've calculated, average person is probably about 85 minutes a day that we spend engaged in those types of activities, and we can transform them from being, instead of seeing them as wastes of time or something that is provoking anxiety or frustration, we can actually transform them into some of the most productive moments of the day and literally rewire our brains in ways that can help us to be more effective, both personally and professionally. So to start off, if you've heard of mindfulness or heard of some of the benefits, it almost sounds like a panacea. I mean, there's scientific research that shows that the practice, lowers blood pressure, and improves the immune system, improves emotional intelligence. It does so many things that I think it almost sounds too good to be true. But if you understand what mindfulness is doing, then I think it seems a little bit more palatable. And so I'd like to start with a question, and that is, I would imagine that no one disagrees, none of you listening would disagree with this statement. All of our success and all of our failures all begin in the mind, right? Everything that we do or fail to do, it all starts in the mind. And yet I know very few people that take time to intentionally train their mind to function better on a daily basis. And I don't think it's because people are lazy. I think it's, for the most part, we just don't know that there's a systematic way of training the mind to function better. And that's what mindfulness training can help us to do. And to give you an idea of who's doing this, in case you're not aware of it, it's almost fad status these days. Some people are even calling it a fad, although I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. You have professional coaches in the NFL and NBA that are teaching their teams mindfulness. You have famous athletes that are doing it. These are just a few of the companies that are some of the most well-recognized brands. There are many other companies that are training their employees in mindfulness. I just chose these because I think we've probably heard of every single one of these. And you would think, why would they do this? I mean, obviously it costs money and time to train people in something Is there any evidence that it works? And I think the reason that the most compelling aspect of the practice all centers around this whole very exciting new area of neuroscience that's referred to as neuroplasticity. So if you were to ask any neuroscientist, maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, if you would have asked, is it possible for you to change the physical structure of your brain past adolescence? I don't think you would have found anyone that said that you could do that. And now we know that that's completely false. Brain is changing all the time as a result of what you do, what you pay attention to, and the first study that showed that quite conclusively, you can make an effort to do something and it actually results in the structural change in the brain, was with juggling. Now, I don't think they were juggling rocks, but I just used that slide because it sticks out a little bit more than juggling balls or something like that. But it was a study conducted by a researcher named Bogdan Dragansky in 2004. And what his study showed was that after just a short time of juggling, I think it was about 3 months of training, there was a noticeable thickening in the part of the brain that is responsible for that kind of spatial memory and essentially the tools that you would need to juggle effectively. And where this whole field got really exciting to me is I think it's kind of intuitive that your brain would change as a result of what you do. For instance, if you play the violin for hours every day for years, you would think that the part of the brain that controls the finger movements would be thicker, and indeed that's what this study showed. But where it got even more interesting to me was that now we know that you can change the physical structure of your brain just by using your mind, which is kind of generally defined as the activity of the brain. So this is a picture of or a map of London downtown. And some of you may be aware that if you wanted to get a license to drive a taxi in London, you need to memorize this map. Essentially, there are some 20,000 routes in there. There are numerous landmarks, and you have to memorize all of that in order to be able to get a license to drive a cab in London. And it takes, on average, the average person about 2 to 4 years of constant training and memorization to be able to do this. And so some researchers in London hypothesized that, I bet these people that are just thinking about these routes all the time, looking at these maps and trying to remember them, the part of the brain that's responsible for spatial navigation is probably different than somebody who doesn't. And as it turns out, that's exactly the case. A researcher named Eleanor Maguire and her team at the University College of London in 2006 first showed that quite conclusively, that the mid-posterior hippocampus, which is the area of the brain responsible for spatial navigation, was significantly thicker in people who had finished this training and completed it versus people who did not, including some controls, like people who drove buses for a living, which they experienced many of the same aspects of driving a cab, except their routes were described, and they were prescribed to them. They didn't have to memorize a route; they just followed. So the cab drivers' brains were significantly different than the bus drivers' brains. And as the interest in mindfulness grew and grew in the West, people started turning their attention to, well, okay, so we know that you can use your mind and that changes the brain. Can mindfulness do that? And there is now a very large body of evidence in the neuroscience community suggesting that mindfulness does indeed change the brain in some very key ways that are very helpful for both personal and professional success. And as I kind of alluded to in the title of this talk, you can literally rewire your brain for excellence, both for leadership excellence and sales excellence, but just excellence in general as a human being as well. So let's talk a little bit about what mindfulness is from what I think is probably the most practical approach. So if you were to go and Google mindfulness or look up mindfulness books, you will find an unbelievable amount of information. And many of the books talk about different techniques that you can practice. And if you only take one thing away from this short time that we have together, I'd like you to just take this away, that it doesn't really matter what technique you're doing. So if you go and you learn more and you find techniques you like, that's great. But it doesn't really matter what technique you're doing. What's most important is your moment-to-moment attitude And that attitude is one of having a beginner's mind. So the essence of the practice is to let go of being our thinking and coming into each moment as though we already know what's going to happen, and just being open and curious without any judgment at all. Just a simple recognition of what's coming in now, and now, and now. And if you can cultivate that kind of curiosity about it, almost as though you were a child. You watch a 3 or 4 year old child explore the world, and it's amazing. I mean, just a rock on the ground can spark intense investigation, right? But for us adults, it usually doesn't happen that way. So this beginner's mind is the essence of the practice. And something that can help facilitate it is just using a practice that's called mental noting. So for instance, right now, you could just simply ask silently in the mind, just ask internally with that inner voice, what's happening right now? Or what is this moment like? And when you ask the question and you're just open, you're not looking for an answer, you're just open. That's it, that's the shift. And as simple as that sounds, something very profound happens when we make that shift from being our inner voice, being that voice that's always talking to ourselves, blabbering away about who knows what, and all of a sudden we become aware of that voice. And I actually call this the shift that changes everything, because it's so profound. So as a visual image, this is how I like to demonstrate it. So the idea is, this is how we normally operate. So we've got this mind, which I've kind of encapsulated in a human head, and it's generally referred to as the thinking mind, and somewhere in there is this ego, the sense of self that we've created, and also in there is awareness of things that are going on, including the sights and the sounds and the smells that we experience. Now, what happens as soon as we have that beginner's mind and we shift from being caught in our thinking, being that voice in our heads, to being that which is aware of it, this is what experience is like. Now, I don't want you to freak out here and think that I'm suggesting that we have some type of out-of-body experience. It's not at all what I'm suggesting. I just use this to give a very clear visual as to what this very subtle shift results in. And that is that now you can see awareness is no longer stuck in thinking. In fact, awareness can now objectively see thinking. And this is the shift that I think changes everything. And I think as we go forward, you'll see why. But the idea is you now have an objective view, not just of the sensations coming in, but even an objective view of your own thinking and even your own emotions. Now, I think a lot of people, when we first start discussing mindfulness, and the first thing they tell me is it seems like this is something I could never do. It seems so challenging, and of course it is not easy. The mind is a very difficult thing to train. However, it's actually not complex. It's very, very simple. In fact, you're already doing this many, many times every day. Every time that you kind of pause and reflect and become aware of your own thinking, you've made the shift to being mindful, or being mindfully self-aware. The problem is that for most of us, this is an unintentional activity. It just kind of happens randomly, and we don't sustain it for very long. For most people, we might become self-aware like that for a few seconds, and then we're sucked right back into being our thinking and talking to ourselves. And so we're constantly bouncing back and forth from being our thinking to being aware of it. So what the training is about, what mindfulness training is about, is making the effort to intentionally become mindfully self-aware, and learning to sustain it for longer and longer periods of time with the intention of that. So instead of it being random, we're doing it intentionally, and in increasingly demanding situations. So initially we may only be able to do this during very simple, mundane activities like taking a walk or brushing our teeth. But with training, we can have this perspective in demanding situations, like having a disagreement with a client or a vendor or a team member or a family member, or being stuck in traffic when we're late for an appointment. And we can maintain this perspective even when the situation is very demanding. That's what the training can result in. Now I want to just go through a couple of the benefits. I think we'll skip this one for Well, actually, I think we will talk about this one. So these are just three very large scale benefits. We can go into much more detail, but just wanted to give you a little bit of the why we should practice, and then we'll go into how to do it. And what I'd like to also do is have quite a bit of time for question and answer here at the end, so we can have a dialogue and make sure that everything that we're talking about is clear. So the first very large scale effect of this is that it makes it much easier to plan, because if we don't have a very clear picture about what the current state of affairs is, then it's very hard to make a plan for the future. I think that this is quite clear. But just to give an example, if you wanted to get to Paris, France, and you weren't sure if you were in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or Cape Town, South Africa, it would be very hard to design a route to get you to Paris. But if you knew for sure that you're starting in Sao Paulo, Brazil, then it's very easy to get to Paris. Well, interestingly, when we operate from the perspective of being our thinking, then we're not actually seeing what's actually happening right now. We're seeing our version of what's happening that's based on our conditioning and all of our life experiences up to this moment in time. So just to give you an example of this, this is actually a very interesting perceptual illusion. So I'd imagine that no one listening would disagree that the block with the letter A on it and the block with the letter B on it are two different colors. And clearly, A is much darker than B. So it might surprise you to know that they are actually the exact same color. So all that I did there was I just cut and moved the letter B. So you can see that there's no, I didn't change the color of that block at all. I just moved it. And that perceptual illusion is created by the shading of that cylinder, which makes the B look much lighter relative to the dark colors around it. So that's one way that our brain kind of fools us. Our conditioning tells us, no way, A and B are obviously different colors, when in fact they're the exact same color. Now, I'm not saying that mindfulness is going to help you not be fooled by a perceptual illusion like this, but what it can help us do is see what's happening in the world with much greater clarity, without being fooled by our conditioning. Because essentially what's happening is, again, to come back to that image, is we're moving from this, where everything that's coming in through our senses is being filtered through that thinking mind and the ego before it gets to awareness, to this, where it's just literally a direct perception of what's happening. And in neuroscience, they've actually identified that when we make the shift to being mindfully self-aware, we actually use a whole different neural network. When we're operating from this perspective, we're operating from what's called the default mode network, and it's very much tied into memory and self-referential thought. And the moment that you switch to being mindful, you switch to very direct perception of what's happening. So you kind of remove those filters of the thinking mind and the ego, which allows you to see things much more clearly. And as a side effect, also, this tends to make life a little bit more enjoyable, because we see everything with fresh eyes, and just going for a walk can be exhilarating, just as it was when we were 5 and we see that little rock on the ground, and we realize that it's quite beautiful. Now, being a little bit more free from our conditioning is also very, very helpful. Many of you, if you don't already have your own team, you might be building one, and even if you're operating on your own, you're still running a business. And I think a lot of people think of business acumen, in terms of your knowledge, right, and what you know about business, what you know about managing the financial statements and growing your business. And to some degree that's true. Obviously we need to have a little bit of knowledge to be able to run a business successfully. But interesting, what tends to make decisions poorer is not necessarily a lack of knowledge in many cases. It's actually a thing called cognitive biases. So we all have biases based on our conditioning, on our life experiences, that kind of flavor the way that we approach a situation and the decisions that we make. And some of these biases have been shown to have very direct impacts on the profitability of a business. So when we switch to our perspective from being caught in our thinking to being aware of that thinking, this actually helps us to see with a little bit greater clarity our tendency to act and decide in certain ways. It can actually allow us to see our cognitive biases, and when we see them, then we're no longer constrained by them, and this can dramatically improve decision making. This has been referred to by some as what we call the space between stimulus and response, which is what Viktor Frankl called the greatest freedom that we can have. Viktor Frankl, by the way, was a neuroscientist. And this is something that is trainable. This is what we're training with mindfulness. Now, just to give you an interesting study that showed how mindfulness improves decision making, there's a game in behavioral economics called the ultimatum game, where people are given somebody offers a certain amount of money. Let's say they have $1,000, and the person says, "Well, I'm gonna keep 999 and give you $1." And of course, many people get offended by that, and they say, "Well, why didn't you split it more equitably?" And so they don't take anything, because the idea is in this ultimatum game, you either have to take what the person offers you or you get nothing. Now, of course, if you were to think with a completely rational mind, taking $1 is better than nothing. And as it turns out, there were some researchers at INSEAD that studied mindfulness practitioners versus non-practitioners in this game, and it turns out that the mindfulness practitioners made significantly more rational choices. They were much more likely to accept what was an unfair offer than the people who had no training. And as I mentioned earlier, so we now know that the training is not just changing how the brain functions, it's actually resulting in structural change. And what we're essentially talking about here with regards to decision making and being free from conditioning is heightened self-awareness. And what this image is showing, this was research conducted at Harvard by Sarah Lazar and her team. And what this research is showing is, you see the very big section there, it's kind of gold. That's an area of the brain called the insula, which is associated principally with self-awareness. And in a very short amount of time, I think for this study here, it was a cross-sectional study. So they were just taking people who had practiced a decent amount of mindfulness versus people who had not. And they found that people who had a modicum of practice, they've been practicing for several years. I think it was 10 years on average, with a decent amount of practice on average. They had significantly thicker insula than controls. And then later they replicated this research using a much shorter time span, just in 8 weeks, and they were able to find significant changes in the brain for people who practiced mindfulness over 8 weeks versus people who did not, in some very key areas. Now, the third general area that I want to talk about, so we've talked about seeing more clearly, which aids planning and makes life a little bit more enjoyable, and making better decisions. Probably most important, I think, in your profession, is emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is really the key to not only creating but sustaining very healthy relationships. And I'm sure you've probably all heard of this, so if you haven't, we can talk more about it in a question and answer. But in case you're not aware, the very foundational skill that facilitates every component of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. For those of you who've read any of Daniel Goleman's work, he talks about that all the time, and he's the guy who literally wrote the book on emotional intelligence. And as you've probably gathered from what we've been discussing so far, mindfulness training is, at its almost by definition, it's self-awareness training. We are making that shift from being our thinking, being that voice in our heads, to being aware of that voice, being aware of our own minds and bodies, including the thoughts that are going through the mind and the emotions in the body. So you could think of, if you go to the gym to build muscles or to build cardiovascular fitness, you could think of mindfulness training as literally an exercise that reshapes your brain in ways that help you to be more self-aware and therefore more emotionally intelligent. Now, as one other just kind of caveat here that I thought I would throw in is that, I think there are many things that we do to develop ourselves professionally, and there are very few that I know of that have nothing but positive side effects. And perhaps one of my favorite aspects of training in mindfulness is that while you're doing this training during your daily activities and potentially rewiring your brain in ways that help you to be more emotionally intelligent, make better decisions, see more clearly, you also find that you're changing your brain in ways that can help you to be happier. And I first discovered this, for those of you who are not familiar with my background, I actually learned about mindfulness during a period of my life that was could have been the worst experience of my life ended up being the best experience of my life. I had done something very stupid and dishonest, and was confined to a military prison for 5.5 years as a result of attempting a fraud against the government. And I had been kind of short-sighted and self-centered for much of my life. And about a year into my time in confinement, I started learning about this training, mindfulness training. And within 6 months, I was going at the practice 100%. I was making the effort to be mindful during just about every activity of the day. And within 6 months, I noticed that I was actually thriving in one of the most stressful environments in the world, and that I was also happier with nothing. I had no possessions, no fun, no girlfriend. I had nothing, and I was happier right there inside of a military prison than I'd ever been in my life. Now, my story is not unique by any means. There are many examples of people whose lives have been absolutely transformed in terms of overcoming depression or overcoming anxiety and realizing very profound levels of happiness. And we now know that mindfulness training changes the brain in some ways that are pretty significant in terms of developing well-being, especially how we generally think of being happy. So while you're training to be more successful professionally, as a side effect, you might find that you become happier as well. So let's talk a little bit about how to make this practice integrated into our lives every day, and then maybe we'll open it up for a question and answer, and then let me actually check the time here. And I'd like to actually do a little bit of practice so you can experience it. Oh, we're doing very well on time. So maybe I'll explain a little bit about the practice. We'll do a little bit of just practicing while being still, because that will probably be easiest during a webinar. And then we'll just have a discussion after that. We'll have a question and answer. So I'd like to think of the practice, or I'd like you to think of the practice, if you would. This is kind of the overall idea. And I hope if you disagree with me on this, please let me know. No one has ever disagreed, but I think for most of us, what would you say our default mode of operation is? If we're brushing our teeth or commuting to work or walking around, for most of us, we spend a good portion of that time, if not completely wandering in thought or letting our mind wander. We are at least partially distracted by thinking. We're talking to ourselves. We're thinking about many things other than what we're doing. Now, of course, if we're engaged in something that requires our attention, like rock climbing or playing a sport or doing something that's really engaging at work, hopefully with a client, you're really engaged with the client, that's probably less so. But during much of our time, our default state is just mind wandering. In fact, there was research conducted at Harvard by Matthew Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert. They looked at, I think it was about 2,500 people, and found through self-reporting, they set up a very interesting mechanism for this. But people, about 50% of the time, it's actually 47% of the time, said that they were completely lost in thought, mind wandering. So, and this is pretty common. I don't think anyone feels like that's a surprise. And most of the people I speak with say that they're at least partially distracted by thinking about 90% plus time. So what I'd like to suggest is that we just simply change our default. When we're not actively engaged in something that requires all of our attention, or when we're not intentionally planning or analyzing data or intentionally thinking in some way where we actually need to be thinking, many of the times we don't. If we're washing the dishes, I don't think we need to be creating a strategic plan for the next 5 years. We could just wash the dishes. And so that's the suggestion, is that you take all of these things that we have to do every day, these simple, mundane activities, and just change the way that we do them so that our default mode is, instead of talking to ourselves and thinking about the past and future and analyzing, to just let go of thinking and to be aware of it and to be fully present with the activity that we're engaged in, or if we're in communication with somebody, to be fully present with the person with whom we're engaged. Now, I'll give you an example here of how this could work. So what I usually suggest, and I think for those of you who attended the teaser, I think I even suggested this just because we had very little time and I wanted to give something for people to walk away with. But we can go into more detail, especially if you've been practicing already since that time. But what I suggest is you make a list of all the activities that you have to do anyhow. Things like brushing your teeth, washing your hands, making the bed, getting dressed, washing the dishes, commuting to work, standing and waiting in line at the grocery store. I mean, that's a very long list. And what I suggest is that for the first week, you just pick one of those activities, and you commit to changing your default during that activity. Instead of letting your mind wander all over the place, make the effort to notice whether or not there's thinking, and that opens your awareness to what else is happening, and trying to stay with the awareness of what's actually coming in through your senses during that activity. And the idea is to try to do that from the beginning to the end of that activity. At the end of that week, you could continue with that one and add a second one. So like maybe week 1, you start with brushing your teeth, like this woman here. She looks like she's really enjoying it. Actually, she looks like she's pretty intense there. I hadn't really noticed that before. But you start with brushing your teeth like this woman, and then maybe the second week you continue with brushing your teeth and you add something else like preparing coffee. Whatever works for you. Now, to help you, what you might want to do is make a little sticky note, because really the biggest challenge for this practice is just remembering that we're trying to change our default. So I would suggest, writing a little sticky note, just maybe a little smiley face, and just put "be mindful" or something, and you can just stick it right next to your toothbrush or stick it right next to the coffee pot before you brew coffee. But so the idea is, while we're brushing our teeth, we just change the way that we do it. I imagine for most of us listening, the experience of brushing our teeth is something like this, right? We're going along for 2 seconds, and before we know it, we're just completely gone, thinking about what the cat just did on the floor, how we need to get to the next appointment very quickly, or our minds are just all over the place. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if everyone listening at least once, maybe multiple times, I know this has happened to me, you've been brushing your teeth and you get to what you think is about halfway through, and then you realize, I don't remember what teeth I brushed, and you need to start over, because we're not there. We're really being or thinking, we're caught in it. So what I would suggest is that we just switch that, and as you get ready to brush your teeth, you've got your toothpaste on the brush, to just pause for a moment and maybe just take one in breath and one out breath, and remind yourself that you're going to brush the teeth and be fully present during that activity. And then just open your senses and just explore. Again, have that beginner's mind, just like a little child, like you've never brushed your teeth before. Just really be curious about, well, what is it like? And if you can maintain that attitude, the practice will be very, very easily. Thoughts are going to come up. It's totally natural. We're not trying to get rid of thinking or block thoughts out. We're just noticing, is there thinking or is there not? And if we can see our thinking objectively like that, then it doesn't distract us. And we can keep that curious attitude of, okay, well, now what is this like? What do the bristles feel like on my teeth? What does the brush feel like in my hand? What do my feet feel like on the floor? And that's it. So again, if you get distracted, you might even mentally note distracted, and you'll notice as soon as you note that, as soon as you become aware of the fact that you're distracted, you just woke up. Now you're mindfully self-aware again. And then you can sustain that mindful self-awareness just by having that curious attitude of, okay, well, what's this moment like? And what's it like now? So that's practicing during activity. Again, very, very simple. There's nothing complex about it. But as I'm sure you'll find if you practice, or if you've already been practicing, I'm sure you've already noticed, orienting and sustaining attention in the present moment may be the most challenging thing you'll ever do in your life. The mind we've been conditioned for so long to value our thinking over what's actually happening in the moment, that we've become it. We become that voice in our heads, and it's definitely not easy to let go of that. But it's fun to practice, and there are obviously many fruits that make it worth it. So I'd like to give you a taste of mindfulness while being still. This is another aspect of the practice. Now, I mentioned to you in the beginning that you can practice mindfulness without adding anything to your schedule, and I would suggest that you can do that even with the practice of stillness. This doesn't require you to go sit in some funny position and put a diaper on like a yogi or something. Not that I have anything against yoga. I think that's a great practice as well. In fact, I actually think yoga is mindfulness in motion. But what I'm suggesting to you is there doesn't have to be anything special or weird about this. You just sit still. And I would hope that you're taking at least a 5 to 10 minute break each morning and each afternoon, and hopefully more than that. If you're not, I would suggest check out the research on how much more productive you'll be if you do take frequent breaks. I think the common recommendation is at least once an hour to take 5 to 10 minutes for a break. You're a super type A like me and you don't like to take breaks, but you just take one 5 or 10 minute break in the morning and one in the afternoon. What I would suggest is that you just change the way that you take a break. instead of maybe scanning Facebook or eating a donut or drinking coffee or something like that. So just take a moment to sit still and practice cultivating this amazing power that ABC Nightline anchor, which is Dan Harris, he calls this a superpower, and I completely agree with him. This is a superpower that we're cultivating, which is freedom from the constraint of our thinking. So I'd like to go through a very brief practice with you of how you can do this just while you're on a break, just so you get a sense of what the experience is like, and then we'll just have a discussion after that and see where we go from there. So I would presume that most of you are sitting. If you're not, that's fine. I'm actually standing. I like to work at a standing desk. But either way, whether you're standing or sitting, the idea is just to be still for a moment. And the benefit of being still is that you can actually see your inner world a little bit more clearly when you don't have to be worried about motion and what's coming at you, what you have to avoid. So this is the benefit of stillness, is that it helps develop greater inner clarity, it helps develop wisdom more quickly. So again, whether sitting or standing, the initiation of the practice is extremely simple. It's just opening your senses to what's happening right now. You could even ask that question in the mind. What is this moment like? And you might notice what it feels like to sit. You might notice your feet on the floor or your legs pressed against the seat. If you like, you can actually close your eyes for a moment. Eyes closed or open, it's not really that important, but it can actually increase inner clarity if the eyes are closed a little bit. You might notice sounds. You might notice sounds in the space around you. Depending on how loud your speakers are, you might notice there's actually an infant in our space here on this end. You might hear a little one in the background from time to time. He's several rooms away, but he's got some good lungs. And as you can just stay with this noticing of what is it like to sit, you'll probably also notice that you're breathing. You'll notice that there's kind of this natural rhythm that the body's breathing on its own, and that each time you breathe in, the belly rises. Each time you breathe out, the belly falls. You may notice air moving past the nostrils or the lips. And I would suggest that while you're practicing while being still, you could allow this awareness of the breath to kind of be a foundation. The idea is we're not trying to focus on the breath. We're not concentrating on the breath. Just knowing that it's happening, noticing whatever is most prominent. And the breath is actually a reminder. With each in-breath and each out-breath, we're being reminded to have this curious, open attitude about what's happening now. So in fact, you might even like to use mental noting. As the body breathes in, you could just note in. As the body breathes out, you can note out. And again, even these mental notes, the in and the out, are just reminders to be open and curious about what you're experiencing right now. Now, we don't have to maintain this awareness for 5 minutes or even, or for an hour. The idea is just to maintain this awareness for one in-breath, and then do it again for one out-breath. So the breath can kind of be this timer and reminder. Each in-breath, open and curious about what's coming in, and with each out-breath, open and curious. So you might simplify that down to just in, what's happening now, out, and now. And then it might just become in and now, out and now. Now you may notice thoughts coming and going as you stay with this gentle reminder with each in-breath. It's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with thoughts coming and going. And even if you become distracted, that's okay too. You can just mentally note, oh, distracted. And then with the next in-breath or out-breath, you can just start right over again with in, and now, out, and now. So that's a very quick taste of the practice, and my guess would be that I think we just did this for 3 minutes or so. That you might notice that you feel just a little bit more space in the mind. Maybe there's a little bit more room in there. Thinking is not so controlling, and that actually becomes much more noticeable with continued practice. So what I would suggest is that you could still be practicing right now, hopefully, just keeping that same perspective of, it's almost as though you're observing yourself sitting there, aware of your own body, aware of your own thoughts, while you listen to my voice or see whatever's on the screen. And notice how you can do that. It's almost as though you're looking out and looking in at the same time. And when you have that kind of nice balance, nothing magical about it, that's it. That's being mindfully self-aware. So what I would suggest is that during your breaks, maybe just, even if you only have 3 minutes, just setting a timer on your smartphone. You could even put your earbuds in if you're in an office so people know that you're intentionally taking a break and they're not going to want to start up a conversation with you. And you could just close your eyes for 3 minutes or leave them open and just look at a wall or something like that. Just be still. That practice is very, very helpful for cultivating the ability to be mindful during daily activities, and vice versa. The more that we practice during daily activity, the easier it is to sit down and immediately have this perspective of being aware of our thinking instead of being caught in it. So that's a quick introduction to the practice. So let's go ahead and do some question and answer here. We have a good almost 20 minutes. I think it's 18 minutes. So let's start off with, would anyone like to share what it was like to just be still and let go of thinking for 3 minutes, and just practice being aware of your own body and mind for 3 minutes? Would anyone like to just briefly comment on what that was like?
I have the questions panel open.
Ozzy, I'm not aware to.
I'm just waiting to see if anybody is submitting any questions or comments regarding that.
Okay. And if nobody wants to share what the experience was like, that's fine. Imagine it might be a minute if people are typing, Ozzy, because it's not a yes or no question. So
one
it might be a second. Somebody might be typing something.
One question that came up, though, is when you're trying to be mindful and these thoughts are kind of pushing in your brain, how can you push those thoughts out so you can have clarity?
I don't think you should try to push the thoughts out. The idea of being mindful is not having a mind that's empty of thought. And I think that's probably one of the most common misconceptions about the practice. So it's totally understandable that you would ask that. And I think we often think of our thinking as the enemy, right? Some of our thinking is so self-limiting and anxiety-provoking that we don't want it there. We want to get rid of it. And what I would suggest to you is that we don't need to get rid of it. What we need to do is be able to see it clearly, see it objectively. And the more space that we have around that thought, the less ability it has to control us. And how that space develops is just learning to rest in that awareness of noticing that thinking is there. So for many people, myself included, I mean, how the brain works this is a very oversimplified explanation. But the idea is, if you're a busy person who's, an agent for Keller Williams, a fabulous organization to work with, but you're still going to be busy. You have goals that you want to hit, both personal and professional, financial. Your days are very busy. You're working evenings. You're working weekends. For you to think that your mind is going to be empty ever is pretty unrealistic, because how the brain basically works is the more that it receives stimulation, the more it has to process. And a lot of that processing, although much of it occurs subconsciously, much of it does occur consciously. We tend to talk to ourselves about what happened yesterday, what happened 5 minutes ago, and that's all part of that processing. So conversely, if you were to go hang out in the woods for 2 weeks camping and not expose yourself to much of any information or anything intellectually stimulating, you might find that your mind becomes very calm and collected, clear, I guess I should say. And And that's kind of a basic idea of what we should expect about how the mind works. So what you can do is, what our tendency is to want to either, get rid of all that thinking that's bothering us, or ignore it or pretend it's not there. And what we try to do with mindfulness is just bring it up and make it fully conscious. And when you do that, the longer you can sustain that, the more space there is around it. And to use an analogy, it's almost as though, let's say your thinking was like a very loud speaker. It's just right next to you, just blaring the most annoying music you could ever hear, which I think for many of us, that's what our minds are, right? It's just this annoying voice that's just always bothering us, right? And much of the time, not always, but much of the time it's quite annoying. And so imagine that speaker's just right there, blasting full blast. Well, that would be really bothersome. It'd probably evoke all types of emotional response in the body. But if you took that speaker and it was now half a mile away, the same volume, there's no problem, is there? I mean, you might not even notice it. I mean, you'll be aware that it's happening, but you won't notice it to the effect where it causes an emotional response. So this is kind of an analogy of what happens when we learn to sustain that mindful self-awareness of our thinking. Now, that being said, what I'd suggest to you is that it's not easy to just be aware of thinking without being sucked right back into it. So that's why it's very helpful to have the body as a foundation. So that's why when we're still, the idea is to notice the body sitting. What does it actually feel like to sit? What is it, noticing what the breath is like, noticing what sounds are coming in, and just staying with these sensations, because if we can stay with those, then you'll notice you do have an objective awareness of your thinking. Thoughts may still be coming and going, but they're not pulling you into them. You're not being sucked into being your thinking. And so that would be my suggestion, is that if you train to not be worried about whether a thinking is there or not, and to even be completely honest about it. Sometimes I'll sit down at the end of a very busy day to do my sitting still practice, and the mind is just going crazy, and I'll just acknowledge that, and I'll just mentally note the mind is very busy. And as soon as I notice that, I've just made that thinking completely conscious, and immediately there's space there. And then if I can stay with that, if I'm aware of my body, aware of what it feels like to sit, aware of the breath, then there's this subtle awareness of the mind, and that space tends to grow and grow. And what you might find as a side effect, again, this should not be the goal, is that the mind does calm down a little bit. But really that's not the point. I think you will find that you can have great peace whether thinking is there or not. The point is just that it doesn't grab you and pull you into the point where you're being that voice in your head.
Awesome.
So hopefully that
Thank you
helps.
so much, Matt. We just had someone write in about the question you had about how the experience was that we just tested with silence, and they commented saying they really enjoyed the silence. They were totally in tune with their breathing, but they continued to feel like they needed to get back to work, like a magnetic pull.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is part of the practice. It's a great insight. Whoever shared that is one of the most important elements of this practice, is that you start to become aware of things that you might not have been aware of before. And you might notice that there is this unbelievable pull, especially when we're doing something that we enjoy, or if there's pressure to hit a goal. We can really have this energy of, I've got to get this done, I've got to get this done, I've got to get this done. And what my experience has been is that when we operate from that perspective, we're not as nearly as effective as we can be. We tend to not be as creative. We tend to not be as efficient. That's actually quite anxiety provoking. So we release these chemicals in the body like norepinephrine and adrenaline and cortisol that actually inhibit how our brain functions and inhibit our immune system. So just the fact that you can be aware of that is a blessing, because if you notice that, then you have some freedom from it. You can notice this pull to say, I don't have 3 minutes to sit, so I have this to do, and I have that to do, and I have that, and you can all of a sudden you realize, wait a second, I can listen to that voice. I can notice the tension in my body. That, I thought it was a great analogy to use of like a magnetic pull. It's almost as though you're being pulled into the future of what you have to do. If you just notice that, if you notice that pull, you listen to the voice, you'll notice that you don't have to follow it. It doesn't have to control you. And right there is a moment of freedom. It's a moment of freedom from habit and from conditioning. Now, of course, there are going to be times when we are very busy and we have to get work done. And I would still, there's plenty of research. If you like, you can shoot me an email and I'll send you the papers on. You'll be so much more productive if you take frequent breaks. The longer you work without a break, the longer the break should be when you do finally take one. But again, I think a good balance is somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes every hour. And you'll find that you'll be more productive when you do that. But you probably will also find that it will be a while before you notice that pull going away. In fact, it may never go away. But you'll notice that it's no longer controlling and it's no longer anxiety provoking. You can just kind of notice it. Eventually you might even be able to smile to it. You might be able to just notice, wow, there's this extreme urge, like you said, a magnetic pull. It feels like I'm just almost being pulled out of my seat to go do what's next. And I don't have to follow it. And you might find that a smile arises when you touch that freedom.
We had another question. Are there any benefits of being mindful individually versus practicing in a group with other people?
I don't know how to quantify that, and I don't know of research per se that indicates that you'll have greater effect if you practice with a group. But I can say qualitatively, that I think there is some benefit to practicing with a group. One, it's just, there seems that, especially if you're in a space and everybody just agrees to be silent for a little while and everybody agrees to do the same practice, you'll find that it seems a little bit easier to do the practice. And I have no idea how that happens. I don't even want to try to comment on it. But that's my experience, is that when everybody agrees, we're not going to follow that pull to the future. We're not going to follow that pull that always has to be doing something. And we're just going to practice being that aspect of ourselves that can just be, that can just know that there is thinking or there is not thinking, that can know the state of the body. It seems to be easier to do it. And of course, there's also the benefit of being able to kind of debrief afterwards and maybe sharing experiences and realizing that we're all kind of experiencing the same thing. We all have these minds that are just absolutely wacko, and they just constantly are going and pulling us in all these different directions, and that we can have a little space around that mind. Both of those things
Awesome.
can be helpful. But I would also say that taking the time to practice on your own also bears great fruit. Sometimes just the added silence and not having to worry about interacting with anybody can be very helpful. So my suggestion would be to kind of play with both and notice the difference. I mean, that's really what probably the most important element of this practice is not to take anything on faith, not to believe anything, but if something makes sense, to give it a try, experiment, and learn through your own experience how the mind works, how the body works. And what you might find is one of the great teachers of mindfulness often taught, his name is Ajahn Chah, is that your own mind and body can teach you everything that you need to know to really be free and to really be effective as a human being, both personally and professionally. If we just take the time to observe this thing, we can learn from it. We can learn a great deal about how it functions, and in that knowledge comes freedom.
Wonderful. We have another question. What is the difference, if there is, between mindfulness and meditating?
Well, there isn't. I think mindfulness is often referred to as mindfulness meditation. I just don't usually use the word meditation because I think it generally conjures up weird images in people's heads, like of a yogi in a diaper sitting on a mountain and chanting Om or something like that. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but mindfulness has nothing to do with anything mysterious or mystical. Again, this is something we already do. It's an inherent human capacity, and it's just a matter of training to do it intentionally and to be able to sustain it at will, and in increasingly demanding situations. So oftentimes I think when people say the word meditation, what they're referring to is the sitting still practice. I just call that practicing mindfulness while sitting still. But it should be with very little exception, the practice should be identical. The same effort that we apply while sitting still should be applied while we're brushing our teeth or driving a car. Now, obviously, one minor exception might be, I think it's a very good idea to have your eyes open while driving your car, whereas while you're sitting still, you might want to close your eyes. And also, you might find that if you're in motion, like brushing your teeth or sweeping the floor or doing the dishes, it might be hard to have the breath as a foundation because the breath is a very subtle thing. So you can just use the sensations of that activity and the awareness of your body standing as kind of the foundation. Whereas when you're sitting still, it's very easy to allow the breath to kind of be the foundation, that reminder to be open and curious for this in-breath and then open and curious for this out-breath. And that's really the only difference that I see. Because even the more, I guess, the more subtle aspect of the practice is learning to not just watch things come and go, but to intentionally investigate them, to actually hold the thought in awareness and see if you can see it arise and cease. And that can actually be done while walking. It can be done while sitting. So really the only differences I would say are whether your eyes are open or closed, or whether the breath is the foundation or the activity itself is the foundation. But practicing while being still or in motion can be essentially identical and should be essentially
Awesome.
identical.
Thank you for clarifying that. That looks like all the questions that we
Sure.
have submitted. So I wanted to thank you again, Matt, for spending time with our KW Young Professionals. We really appreciate you taking this hour out of your busy day to share these things on mindfulness with us.
It's my pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thanks for inviting me,
And
Ozzy.
everyone else, a recording of this webinar will be posted on the members only website. And without that, we want to say goodbye to everyone. So thank you, Matt. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.